Naomi Brooks stood at the galley counter, the faint hum of the luxury yacht beneath her feet. The polished steel surfaces gleamed with the reflection of soft lights, their glint almost too perfect to be real. She glanced out through the porthole, only to see the sprawling expanse of the Mediterranean, stretching out under a bright blue sky. The yachts around them were monuments to wealth, each one more lavish than the last. The water was a mirror, almost too still, the kind of peace that seemed out of place in a world so busy, so full of power. Her world was one of stainless steel counters, gleaming knives, and the quiet rhythm of chopping, sautéing, and plating. Naomi had worked on the yachts for years now, ever since she moved to Monaco from her hometown in New Orleans. But while the luxury around her had become almost routine, her heart always beat faster when she remembered the life she had left behind. The life where everything was uncertain, where you never knew what the next day would bring. The life where she was just another face in the crowd, fighting for space. She wasn't sure why she came to Monaco in the first place. Maybe it was the promise of something bigger, or the hope of leaving behind a world that always made her feel invisible. She'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood, in a home where money was never easy to come by. And dreams, well, those were things you tried not to get too attached to. Her mom worked 2 jobs, and her dad, well, her dad was a ghost she only knew in fragments. Naomi often wondered what he would have thought of her now, here working in kitchens, invisible in plain sight. She wasn't complaining. No, not exactly. She loved the work, the rhythm of the kitchen, the steady flow of orders coming in and out. It gave her something to focus on. But the truth was, Naomi didn't belong here. Not among these people, these figures of immense wealth and power who walked through the doors of the yacht with their tailored suits, their shiny shoes, their designer watches. They barely looked at her. They didn't need to. To them, Naomi was just a cook, a faceless part of the machinery of their lives, existing only to serve, to make sure the champagne was chilled, the filet was seared perfectly, the souffle was fluffed. She had become so skilled at blending into the background, at making herself small, that no one ever really saw her. She moved through the yacht's grand dining areas like a shadow, delivering plates of food, taking orders, making herself as unobtrusive as possible. There were times when Naomi would stand in the corner of the galley, watching the guests, men and women who didn't care if she lived or died, talking about things that seemed so far beyond her. Discussions about board meetings, mergers, and charitable donations that, in the grand scheme of things, only served to pad the already full pockets of those who had everything. Yet Naomi's gaze always lingered. She would stare at them for a moment longer than necessary. Some of them would glance back at her. Just a quick look, nothing substantial. But there was something in their eyes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe they wondered if she could hear the things they said, see the things they did when they thought no one was watching. Because Naomi, in all her invisibility, saw things. She saw the power dynamics, the way the world shifted under the weight of money, of influence. She saw how people like her, people from working class backgrounds, were always just beneath the surface of everything, never invited to join the conversation, but always present in the background. She had learned how to read people's faces. She knew when the guests were satisfied with their meal or when they were just being polite. She knew when someone was hiding something or when the air in the room had shifted. Naomi never spoke about these things, never pointed them out. It wasn't her place, not on a yacht like this. But there was one man on this yacht who caught her attention every time he came aboard, the billionaire, Omar Al-Fahad. He was the one who owned the yacht, who had the power to summon anyone, to move mountains with a phone call, to bend the world to his will. He never gave Naomi more than a passing glance, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something that told her he was different from the other guests. He had a certain intensity to him, like a man who was always calculating, always thinking ahead, always planning. Naomi had heard bits and pieces of the conversations that surrounded Omar. People spoke about him with a mixture of awe and fear. His business empire spanned the globe. His reach stretched from the oil fields of the Middle East to the financial hubs of Europe. He was untouchable, a force of nature, a man who had everything. And yet, whenever Naomi crossed paths with him, there was a coldness in his eyes as though she wasn't even there. She wasn't sure why, but the coldness of his gaze stuck with her. It wasn't the coldness of someone who didn't notice her. It was the coldness of someone who simply didn't care, as if she were a shadow, a fleeting detail in his grand, opulent world. Naomi tried to ignore it. She wasn't a part of that world anyway. She was here to do a job. But deep down, there was a part of her that wished for more. Something bigger than being invisible. Something that didn't involve just standing in the corner of a kitchen, waiting for someone else to take notice. She had never thought much about ambition, but now it felt like a longing she couldn't shake. The summit was coming up, an event Omar had meticulously planned for months. Business deals, legal wrangling, and even humanitarian talks were on the agenda. Everyone aboard the yacht knew how important this summit was. The guests, powerful politicians, business tycoons, world-renowned philanthropists would be watching. Naomi knew her role. She would be a shadow in the kitchen, preparing the food that would fuel the grand discussions, while the powerful figures on the deck made decisions that would affect the world in ways she could never imagine. But it was all just part of the job. And yet, as she watched the flurry of activity in the galley, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It wasn't just the summit or the men in suits who walked the deck like kings. It wasn't the bustling kitchen or the polished silverware that gleamed on every table. It was the knowledge that she was here, watching, listening, ready to uncover the truth behind what was happening in the room she could never enter. Maybe, just maybe, she would no longer remain invisible. The hum of the yacht's engines was a constant in Naomi's life, a background rhythm that never quite disappeared. She had learned to block it out long ago, but today it seemed louder somehow, as if the yacht itself was carrying the weight of the events unfolding aboard. The summit was drawing near, and the yacht was alive with activity, buzzing with the final preparations for what was to be one of the most influential gatherings of the year. Naomi moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her hands working faster than her mind. She had perfected the art of remaining invisible, being present but unseen. It was her unspoken job to make the world of the yacht run smoothly, but never to draw attention to herself. As she prepared trays of hors d'oeuvres, glistening with delicate garnishes, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. Some guests spoke in low voices, speaking of global trade deals, new oil ventures, and partnerships that would alter the world's economy. Others discussed the weather, the latest fashion trends, or the upcoming gala that was to take place the next evening. Naomi had learned to tune them all out until she heard something that struck her like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't the voices in the hallway. It wasn't the hushed, hurried conversations of the summit organizers. No, this time, it was the words themselves. Naomi was leaning over the prep counter, chopping vegetables, when she overheard a familiar name, one she hadn't expected to hear. Omar al-Fahad. She glanced up and caught the fleeting figure of two men walking by, their hushed conversation flowing just under the threshold of her hearing. She knew better than to make it obvious she was listening, but the words grabbed her, pulling her into a narrative she had no business knowing. "They're waiting for the documents to be finalized," one man said. "Once the numbers are altered, we can divert the funds." The other man chuckled lowly, almost nervously. "It's just a small reallocation. No one will know. The humanitarian project is just a front." Naomi's knife paused mid-slice, her heart racing. She leaned slightly forward, straining to catch every word. The conversation continued, but the words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into her chest. The accounts are set. Funds for the water project, the healthcare initiative, it's all moving into our private holding. The board will approve it once we smooth things over with the higher-ups. It'll be clean. Nobody will suspect a thing. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of what they were discussing became clear. They weren't just talking about money. They were discussing the theft of millions of dollars intended for the most vulnerable people in the world. The very people who needed it the most, whose lives depended on the aid that was being manipulated behind the scenes. Naomi's mind reeled. She had overheard things before, things she wasn't supposed to hear. But this wasn't just gossip or idle chatter. This was a betrayal on a massive scale, and she couldn't ignore it. Every word seemed to burn into her memory, every detail etched into her mind as the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicked together. This wasn't just corporate mismanagement. This was fraud. This was a crime that could change the lives of millions. As she stood frozen, the two men walked away, their voices fading. Naomi's hands trembled, and for a moment she couldn't even remember the knife she had been holding. She stared at the vegetables, suddenly disinterested in the task. She had no idea how long she stood there, caught between the compulsion to act and the crushing fear of what might happen if she did. Her thoughts whirled in a chaotic spiral. She had always kept her head down, always remained in the background. But this was different. The betrayal of trust, of the millions of people who had been promised help, was more than just corporate greed. It was personal. It was lives being stolen for the sake of power and wealth. What could she do? She was just a cook, an anonymous part of a machine that existed only to serve. She wasn't in a position to confront Omar al-Fahad or anyone in the elite circles aboard this yacht. She wasn't an activist or a lawyer or a whistleblower. She was a cook, a woman who had always kept her distance from the world of power, and yet the weight of the injustice felt unbearable. How could she remain silent when she knew what was happening? Naomi turned the knife over in her hands, examining its blade as if it might hold the answers. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. This was wrong. What they were doing was wrong, and she couldn't look the other way anymore. But how could she expose the truth? She was nobody. She had no power. A moment passed. The decision seemed impossible, too risky, too dangerous. She wasn't even sure where to begin. She couldn't just walk up to Omar al-Fahad or any of his associates and confront them. She didn't have the credentials, the status, or the influence. But there was one thing she did have: knowledge. She knew the kitchen. She knew the yacht's routines. She had heard enough to piece things together. And more importantly, she knew she couldn't stay silent. There were other people out there, people who would listen, who could help. If she could find a way to get the evidence out, maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. But first, she had to be sure. She had to be certain that she wasn't just imagining things. Naomi took a deep breath, wiping her hands on the apron. The kitchen felt smaller now somehow, more claustrophobic. The walls closed in, as though the weight of what she had overheard was pressing in from all sides. She had just become an unwilling participant in a conspiracy, and she had no idea how far the consequences would stretch. As the hours passed, Naomi tried to focus on her work, but the events of the day hung over her like a storm cloud. The voices of the two men echoed in her mind, their words a constant reminder of the decision she now faced. She had crossed a line by overhearing the conversation, but now she was faced with the hardest part: whether to act on what she knew or to remain silent and let the injustice unfold. Outside the galley, the yacht was still, a beautiful world of privilege and power, but Naomi couldn't help feeling that her place in it had shifted forever. She wasn't just an observer anymore. No, Naomi Brooks had become something more. She was a witness, and the truth had a way of making itself known, whether she was ready for it or not. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, contemplating what to do next. The screen lit up, but she didn't make the call. Not yet. Not until she knew for sure. Her world had changed. The days that followed Naomi's discovery felt like an eternity. The yacht continued to glide through the Mediterranean, cutting through the calm sea as if nothing had changed. The summit was now in full swing, the guests enjoying their high-stakes discussions, while Naomi moved through the galley, her hands mechanical as she prepared food, arranged platters, and served drinks. But she wasn't really there anymore. Not in the way she used to be. Her mind, her thoughts, they were all consumed by what she had overheard, the documents she had seen, and the people who had been so casually discussing the theft of millions meant for the poor, for the vulnerable, for those who depended on international aid. And Naomi? Naomi had heard it all. She couldn't forget it. No matter how hard she tried to keep her head down, no matter how much she wanted to retreat into her old role of invisibility, she could feel it gnawing at her every waking moment. The weight of silence was heavier than she had imagined. Every time she walked through the yacht's gleaming halls, she saw the wealth on display, the extravagant decorations, the fine wines, the diamonds sparkling around the necks of women in designer gowns, the handshakes and quiet promises exchanged between powerful men. She saw all of it, and it all felt so wrong now. How could she continue serving them when she knew what they were doing, what they were planning? The laughter of the guests seemed to mock her every time it echoed through the grand hallways. The polished floors, the walls lined with priceless art, the clear blue skies outside, all of it felt like a facade, a carefully constructed lie. And Naomi was caught in the middle of it, her hands stilling on the knives, her eyes darting nervously to the door, her heart thumping in her chest. Was she really ready to face the consequences of speaking out? The power of these people, their influence, their control over systems was enormous. She had worked hard to get where she was, and she had seen enough of the world to know how quickly a person could be erased, how easily a person could be made to disappear when they got in the way. Naomi had never considered herself a radical. She was a cook, a woman who understood the importance of feeding people, of nourishing them, of making them feel cared for. But this was different. What she had heard, what she had seen, it was a betrayal of a magnitude she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the money. It was about lives, futures. It was about children in remote villages who would go thirsty, about mothers and fathers who would go without medical care, because the people in power chose greed over compassion. She had always kept to herself, had always stayed in the background. That was how she had survived in this world of luxury, in this gilded cage. She had learned to be invisible, to move quietly among the guests, always serving but never seen. But now she felt like a prisoner of her own silence. The decision to speak out weighed heavily on her. She was nobody, just a cook, just a woman in an apron. What could she possibly do to bring this injustice to light? She didn't have the power, the influence, or the connections. She wasn't an investigative journalist or a lawyer. She wasn't someone who had the training or the resources to take on people like Omar al-Fahad. But deep down, Naomi knew she had something more powerful than all of those things combined. She had the truth. She had seen the cracks in the system, and she couldn't ignore them. The truth. It was a sharp, unforgiving thing. It could tear lives apart, expose the darkness hidden beneath layers of money and power. But it could also heal. It could bring justice if it was spoken loud enough, forcefully enough. Naomi had never thought of herself as brave, never saw herself as someone who would challenge the world. But now she realized that she couldn't live with herself if she did nothing. She couldn't go back to being silent, not when people's lives were at stake. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of the injustice. The passengers, rich, untouchable, their power absolute, walked around with their faces lit by false smiles, their conversations laced with casual promises that would never be kept. They talked about their charitable foundations, their plans to give back to the world. But Naomi knew the truth that none of their charity would reach the people who needed it most. It would all be diverted into private accounts, shuffled away into hidden places where it could never do any good. What they were doing wasn't just fraud, it was betrayal, and Naomi could no longer pretend she didn't know. The hardest part, she realized, was not knowing what to do. It was knowing what would happen once she did. She had always been the one who worked hard, who kept her head down, and who smiled politely when others spoke about their lives and their dreams. She was never the one to stir the pot, to question the status quo. But now the truth had forced her into a position where silence was no longer an option. Naomi paced the small kitchen, her mind racing. She had to make a choice. The summit was nearing its end. The guests were preparing to leave. And the deal, the one that would divert millions from the humanitarian efforts, would soon be finalized. She had little time left. If she didn't act now, the opportunity would slip away, and the money would be gone, funneled into secret accounts, used to further the empire of the very people who had already taken so much from those who had nothing. The question was, who would believe her? How could she prove what she had overheard? Would anyone listen to a cook who had spent her days serving canapes and filling wine glasses? Would anyone take her seriously when she stepped forward with the truth? She looked at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could feel the weight of the decision in her chest, each beat of her heart thumping louder in her ears. She had never been a fighter. She had always avoided conflict, always chosen peace. But what she had overheard, what she had seen, it was too important to ignore. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The silence was suffocating. She could hear the echo of the guests' laughter above her, their conversations swirling like smoke around her. The weight of the summit, the weight of her own indecision, pressed down on her, suffocating her in the small confines of the galley. In that moment, Naomi knew that silence had become her enemy. She could no longer remain passive. She could no longer pretend that she was just a cook, just a nobody. No, she had to act. The question was, how? She couldn't go directly to Omar al-Fahad, not with nothing but a whispered conversation to back her up. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Maybe she could find someone she could trust, who could help her expose the truth. But Naomi didn't have the luxury of time. Every minute that passed, the deal moved closer to being finalized. The money would be gone, the opportunity lost, and the people who needed it the most would never know what had happened. With one last look at the polished kitchen, Naomi made up her mind. She would act. She didn't know how yet, but she would, and she would make sure the world knew the truth, no matter the cost. As the yacht continued its journey through the waters, Naomi's world was changing. The quiet observer had become a participant in something much larger than herself, and the silence she had carried for so long was finally breaking. Naomi sat on the small, unremarkable stool in the corner of the galley, her fingers nervously tapping against the cool metal surface of the counter. The yacht rocked gently, the faint sounds of conversation and laughter from above reaching her ears, but they felt like distant echoes now. She had long since stopped paying attention to the chatter, her mind consumed with the weight of what she had learned, the betrayal she had uncovered, the document, the fraudulent transaction, the human cost. It all swirled in her mind like a storm that refused to settle. She had seen so many things in her life, had been a witness to so many injustices, big and small. But this was different. This was a betrayal of the highest order. Lives were at stake, and she had the power to stop it. Or at least she could try. The question that gnawed at her, though, was the same one that had been eating away at her since the moment she'd overheard the conversation between those powerful figures. What should I do? She had spent her whole life in the background, a cook, a servant, a nobody. That was how the world saw her and how she had learned to see herself. But now things were different. She couldn't ignore what she had heard, couldn't act as if it wasn't happening. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't speak up, if she allowed the corruption, the lies to continue unchecked. But the fear, the fear was overwhelming. Naomi had worked hard to get where she was, climbing the ranks in a world that had always treated her as lesser, and yet here she was, contemplating throwing it all away. For a chance, for a choice she wasn't sure she could even make. She stared down at her hands, palms sweating as the weight of the decision settled like a boulder in her chest. What if no one believes me? What if I'm wrong? What if... The questions ran in circles in her mind, the doubts creeping up like shadows in the dim kitchen. Naomi knew that she was no expert in international law or corruption investigations. She was just a cook. And who was she to challenge the billionaires, the men and women who held all the cards, who could crush her in an instant if they wanted to? She had heard stories, stories of whistleblowers who had been silenced, of those who had tried to stand up for what was right, only to find themselves blacklisted, erased from the records, forgotten by the world. Naomi had worked for years to avoid such fates. She had learned to be invisible, to be the quiet one in the room. She had learned how to remain unnoticed, because being noticed often meant being punished. But now she was faced with a truth she couldn't ignore. The money that was supposed to go to help the poor, to help those without clean water, those without food, was being stolen, diverted, and she had seen it happen. She had heard the conversation, seen the documents, and she knew what was coming. The yacht continued its journey through the Mediterranean, and Naomi could feel the distance between herself and the people above, those who dined on luxury and thought nothing of the consequences of their actions. And yet, they were the ones who controlled the world, the ones who held the power, the ones who were making decisions that affected millions of lives. Naomi swallowed, feeling the lump in her throat. She was angry, but there was a strange sense of power in her anger too. She had the truth. She had the knowledge that could tear down the empire that these people had built, the empire that had been built on the backs of the weak and the poor. She could change something. She could stop it, or at the very least, she could try. She looked out of the small porthole in the galley, her eyes tracing the calm waters of the Mediterranean, the horizon blending with the sky in a blur of blues. She had always loved the sea. It had always seemed so vast, so endless, so much like her dreams. But now the ocean seemed more like a barrier, an endless divide between her and the world she had always known. Her phone buzzed, a message lighting up the screen in front of her. It was from Sarah, the other cook who worked with her. "Everything okay?" it read. Naomi stared at the message for a moment, a deep sigh escaping her lips. She had always been the strong one, the one everyone turned to for support, for stability. But now she wasn't sure she could offer anyone anything. Not until she made a choice. And even then, she wasn't sure what kind of person she would be. The message blinked at her, the words on the screen small and simple, but they felt like a lifeline. She could text back, tell Sarah everything was fine, tell her she just needed to focus on the job. But the truth was, Naomi wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine since that moment she overheard the conversation. She had never felt this unsettled before. She set the phone down and leaned back against the counter, rubbing her forehead. The summit would be over soon. The deals would be signed. The money would change hands, and the world would keep turning as it always had. But Naomi knew that if she did nothing, if she allowed this to happen, she would be complicit. She would be as much a part of the betrayal as the people who were making it happen. Her heart raced as she thought of the document she had seen. Numbers, figures, names. It was all there. The proof. The proof that something terrible was unfolding right in front of her eyes. If she didn't act, if she didn't speak out, she would be letting them get away with it. And she couldn't live with that. Naomi stood up abruptly, the decision suddenly crystal clear in her mind. She couldn't just sit here in this galley, pretending everything was fine. She couldn't keep going back to her station and serving the very people who were destroying lives for their own gain. She had to act. She grabbed her phone again, her fingers shaking slightly as she typed a quick message to Sarah. "I'll be fine. Just a lot on my mind. See you later." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. She set the phone back down and took a deep breath. It was time. She knew that once she spoke up, there was no turning back. Her life would change one way or another. There was a risk in everything, but sometimes the risk was the only thing worth taking. She had to trust that her voice, the one that had always been quiet, always been overlooked, could make a difference. That the truth she held inside her could set something into motion, something far bigger than herself. She looked at herself in the polished surface of the countertop, taking in the reflection of a woman who had been invisible for far too long. A woman who was finally ready to be seen. No more silence. No more waiting. Naomi stepped out of the galley, her feet moving steadily toward the door of the conference room. The place where the deal would be made, the place where she could make her stand. With every step, she felt the weight of the moment growing heavier, but she also felt a strange lightness inside her. The truth was on her side. It was time to speak. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the grand conference room on the yacht. The hallways were filled with soft murmurs of conversation, the smell of expensive perfumes lingering in the air, the click of polished shoes against the marble floors. She had walked these halls countless times, invisible, unnoticed, just another cog in the machine. But this time, she wasn't just passing through. This time, she was about to change everything. She paused for a moment, standing at the edge of the hallway, staring at the grand door in front of her. The polished wood gleamed in the soft light, and beyond it lay the powerful, the untouchable, the elite of the elite. The summit was in full swing. The world's most influential people gathered in one room to make decisions that would affect the future of nations. And there she was, Naomi Brooks, a cook about to step into that world, to expose a betrayal that could tear it apart. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and determination. It was a strange feeling, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could send her tumbling into a world that had no place for her. But in her gut, there was something else too. Something stronger, a quiet voice that told her she was doing the right thing. The only thing. Naomi took a deep breath. She had no idea what to expect when she entered that room. She had no plan beyond speaking the truth, but somehow that was enough. The document, the transaction, the betrayal, it was all real. There was no turning back now. The moment had come. She pushed open the door, the sound of it creaking in the silence like an omen. As she stepped inside, the room seemed to freeze. Conversations halted, eyes turned toward her. There, sitting at the long, polished table, were the faces she had seen from afar. The billionaires, the CEOs, the powerful men and women who controlled the world with a flick of their fingers. And at the head of the table, the man who had made all this possible, Omar al-Fahad. Naomi's eyes locked with his for a brief moment, and something flickered in his gaze. Surprise? Disbelief? Maybe even a hint of fear. She couldn't be sure, but she didn't care. She had come here for one thing, and one thing only. She couldn't be intimidated now. Her voice, when it came, was steady but trembling with the weight of what she was about to do. Naomi began, her words feeling foreign in the air. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I have something to say. The room was silent. No one moved. She could feel the tension, the eyes of the world's most powerful people on her, waiting for her to speak. She stepped forward, the echo of her heels against the marble floor seeming to carry for miles. Omar al-Fahad was the first to speak, his voice low and controlled. "What is this, Naomi?" he asked, his words laced with annoyance. "You've interrupted a very important discussion." Naomi didn't flinch. She had been invisible for so long, but now in this moment, she felt more alive than she had ever felt before. She wasn't afraid of the power in this room. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. All that mattered now was the truth. "I overheard something," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Something that shouldn't have happened." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The silence was palpable, and Naomi knew she had everyone's attention now. She had the room where she wanted it, but it wasn't enough. She had to do more than just get their attention. She had to make them listen. "I found a document," she continued, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled through the folder she had brought with her. She could hear the rustle of papers, the sound of it like thunder in her ears. "A document that shows how funds meant for a humanitarian project, money that was supposed to help people, was being diverted." She could see the shift in the room then, the subtle tightening of jaws, the narrowing of eyes. People began to look at each other, whispering in hushed tones. Naomi could feel the weight of their gaze, some calculating, others confused, but most were fearful. She knew this was it. She had to press on. "There are clauses in this document," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Hidden clauses. Ones that alter the numbers, direct funds to private accounts. And I have proof. Proof that someone in this room is responsible for this fraud." A murmur rippled through the room, the tension thickening like smoke. Naomi could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the disbelief, the contempt, but most of all, the fear. They were afraid of her now, afraid of the truth she was about to expose. Omar al-Fahad stood then, his chair scraping across the floor. He was no longer the composed, confident man he had been just moments ago. His face was hard, his jaw clenched. "Enough," he said, his voice cold, almost threatening. "You have no idea what you're doing, Naomi. You've crossed a line." Naomi didn't back down. She had come too far. She had made a decision, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, meeting his gaze head on. "I'm exposing the truth, and you can't hide it anymore." The silence was suffocating now, each word she spoke echoing in the room like a drum beat. She watched as the people around the table shifted uneasily, their discomfort palpable. Some of them were trying to maintain their composure, but others, Naomi could see it in their eyes, were starting to panic. Omar stepped forward, his expression now one of controlled fury. "You'll regret this," he warned, his voice low but unmistakable. Naomi held her ground, her heart pounding, but her resolve solid. "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're the one who will regret this, because the truth is out now, and nothing can change that." The room erupted in chaos. People started speaking over each other, their voices rising in alarm and disbelief. Some tried to dismiss her, others tried to silence her, but Naomi stood tall, her eyes fixed on Omar. She had done it. She had spoken the truth. But it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Naomi stepped back from the table, the weight of the room's collective gaze pressing down on her. She could feel the energy shift, the once unseen tension now erupting like a storm. "Naomi, leave now," Omar said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You've made your point. You're done here." Naomi didn't look back as she turned and walked out of the room. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't help the sense of triumph that surged through her. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. But as the door closed behind her, she knew that this was just the beginning. The world would never be the same again. Naomi stood on the deck of the yacht, staring out at the vast, glittering ocean that stretched endlessly before her. The gentle sway of the boat beneath her feet should have been soothing, but all she could feel was the weight of what she had just done. The truth, her truth, had been spoken, and there was no turning back now. The world had seen her stand up against the powerful, the untouchable, and while the sense of triumph still lingered in her chest, it was accompanied by something darker, something heavy. The wind tugged at her hair as she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She could still hear the voices from the conference room echoing in her mind, the disbelief, the anger, the fear. And then Omar's cold words, the threat that she would regret this. She didn't regret it, not yet, but something inside her warned that the cost of her actions was going to be steep. She wasn't naive enough to think that there wouldn't be consequences. After all, how could she expect anything less from a system built on power, wealth, and corruption? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from Veronica Ellison. "Are you okay?" Naomi exhaled sharply. She hadn't heard from Veronica in a while. Veronica was the one person on the yacht who had shown her any semblance of respect, who had listened when Naomi had spoken out in that conference room. But now things had changed. Things were different. Naomi typed back quickly, her fingers trembling slightly. Naomi Brooks. "I'm fine. But it's over, isn't it? They won't stop until they bury me." She hit send and waited, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the horizon. Her world felt like it had shifted beneath her feet. She had made a decision, and there was no way to undo it. The betrayal she had uncovered was too big, too ugly. People had already started reacting, some in fury, some in disbelief. But in Naomi's heart, there was a single undeniable truth. She had done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. Naomi didn't hesitate. She answered immediately. "Naomi?" Veronica's voice was calm but edged with concern. "We need to talk. Come to my office when you're ready." Naomi felt a chill spread through her as she heard the urgency in Veronica's voice. She knew what this meant. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. But in the aftermath, everything was falling apart. "I'll be there soon," Naomi replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up and stood for a moment longer, staring at the endless expanse of water. It was beautiful, tranquil, but Naomi felt disconnected from it. She didn't belong here, on this yacht, in this world. She never had. She made her way to the elevator and took it down to the lower decks. The yacht was a maze of corridors, luxurious suites, in staff-only spaces that Naomi had grown accustomed to over the years. But today, everything felt different. The soft hum of the engines beneath her feet felt like a distant memory, and the polished wood of the walls seemed colder than before. When she arrived at Veronica's office, the door was slightly ajar. Naomi knocked lightly, and Veronica's voice called out from inside. "Come in!" Naomi pushed the door open and stepped inside. Veronica was standing by the window looking out at the view. The sunlight bounced off the water, casting a golden hue across the room. But Naomi knew that this moment of serenity would not last. "Sit," Veronica said softly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Naomi did as she was told, settling into the seat, her nerves still raw from the confrontation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, Veronica turned to face her, her eyes weary but steady. "I need to know what you're thinking, Naomi," she said. What you did it was brave, but it's going to have consequences." "You know that, right?" Naomi nodded, her gaze fixed on Veronica. She could see the concern in her eyes, the way her jaw tightened, as if she were preparing for something that neither of them could avoid. "I know," Naomi said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. But it had to be done. People need to know the truth. Someone had to stop them. Veronica sighed, stepping away from the window to sit behind her desk. She crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "Naomi, listen," Veronica began, her voice measured but firm. "What you did, exposing Omar like that, it's going to set off a chain of events. People are already talking, and not just about you, about the yacht, about the summit. There are powerful people involved in this, Naomi, people who don't take kindly to being exposed. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Naomi's stomach twisted at the weight of Veronica's words. She did understand. She had known the risks when she decided to speak up, but hearing the reality of it, the danger she had put herself in, was something different. "I get it," Naomi replied, her voice shaking slightly. "I know I've put myself in danger, but I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't stay silent." Veronica looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, she leaned forward and spoke again, this time softer. "Naomi, I'm not saying what you did was wrong. In fact, I think it's the bravest thing I've ever seen. But the cost—" Veronica paused, her eyes scanning Naomi's face, searching for something. "You have to be prepared for the fallout. It won't be easy. They won't stop until they silence you." Naomi swallowed hard, but she refused to let herself show weakness. She had made her decision, and now she would live with it. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. "I've made my peace," Naomi said, her voice growing stronger. "I did what I had to do, and if I have to fight for it, then I will." Veronica studied her for a moment longer before nodding, a look of respect crossing her face. "You're right," she said quietly. "You've done the right thing. But know this, Naomi, what comes next will test you. They will come after you, and it won't just be the ones on this yacht. It's bigger than that." Naomi's mind raced. The reality of what she had just set in motion was only beginning to sink in. She had spoken the truth, but in doing so, she had opened a door to a world she was unprepared for. "What do I do now?" Naomi asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Veronica leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. "You keep going," she said. "You stand firm. People will listen to you, Naomi. Your voice is powerful now. Don't let them silence you." Naomi nodded slowly, the gravity of Veronica's words settling deep in her chest. The road ahead would be hard, but she had made her choice. There was no turning back. As she left Veronica's office, Naomi's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. She couldn't shake the image of Omar's cold, threatening gaze, or the sense of finality in his voice. The world was changing now, and she had played a part in it. But the cost of that truth, the cost was something she hadn't fully realized yet. She stepped out into the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty yacht. She was alone now, but not for long. She knew that soon she would have to face the consequences of her actions, and when she did, she would be ready. Naomi's small apartment felt different now. The clutter of everyday life, an unmade bed, dishes stacked high, the scattered bills on the counter, seemed distant, like a different life, a past that no longer held any meaning. She had stepped into a storm, and as much as she wanted to retreat into the quiet of her old existence, there was no turning back. The world had seen her truth, and in return, it had seen her. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, the constant stream of messages a reminder that her life had changed in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She hesitated before picking it up, as if the weight of the device somehow reflected the weight of the world that had suddenly been placed upon her shoulders. The first message was from a news outlet, asking for a statement. The next one was from an old acquaintance, congratulating her for her courage. Another was a simple message of support from someone she didn't even know, an activist in Nairobi, urging her to keep pushing forward. And then there were the ominous ones. Her heart dropped when she saw a message from an unknown number, simply reading, "You've made a terrible mistake." She quickly scrolled past it, trying to ignore the sense of dread gnawing at her insides. Naomi had known this would happen. She had known the threats would come, but now that they were real, it felt different. With a heavy sigh, she sank into the couch, her phone still clutched in her hand. She wasn't sure what to do. The truth she had exposed had spread like wildfire, and now it was beyond her control. She had no idea where it would take her, but she couldn't pretend it hadn't already begun to affect her, deeply, personally, and globally. The world was reacting. People were talking. She pulled up a news site and scrolled through the headlines. Whistleblower reveals massive corruption at luxury summit. Naomi Brooks, the cook who took down an empire. She felt a strange mix of pride and fear as she read the articles. Her name splashed across the screen, her face in photos she didn't remember taking. It was surreal. A video popped up, a clip from the summit, showing her confrontation with Omar al-Fahad. In it, her voice was shaky but resolute, exposing the fraudulent documents that had been hidden from the public. She watched herself for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest as she replayed the words she had spoken. So sure of herself in the heat of the moment, yet now faced with the consequences, she questioned every choice. But as the video continued, the comments section beneath it began to fill up. Finally, someone who's not afraid to speak the truth. This woman has more courage than the entire board combined. We need more people like Naomi. The messages were flooded with praise, but she knew this wouldn't last. Not everyone would celebrate her bravery. Not everyone would want to see the world change. Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with an email from Veronica. She opened it immediately, desperate for some form of reassurance. Veronica Ellison. Naomi, I hope you're doing well. I've been in contact with several NGOs and human rights organizations that want to collaborate. There's a lot of movement happening behind the scenes. People are listening. They're already taking action, and it's all because of you. We can't slow down now. The momentum is real. Let's talk soon. I'm proud of you. You're doing this. Naomi leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. The weight of the words settled in. The momentum is real. She had started something. The world was responding, but not all of it would be kind. Her phone buzzed once again, this time a call. She answered without looking, her pulse quickening. Naomi, Veronica's voice crackled through the line. We need to move fast. You've got a chance to speak at an international anti-corruption summit in Nairobi. They want you to keynote. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Nairobi, Africa. She hadn't thought her actions would reach that far, but here it was, an invitation from people who saw her not as a cook, but as a leader. What do I do? Naomi asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. You speak. You keep speaking, Veronica replied firmly. The world is listening. You can be the voice for everyone who's been silenced. This isn't just about what happened on that yacht anymore. It's about every corrupt system that needs to be exposed. Naomi let her words sink in, her mind whirring. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about changing the world. The next few days were a whirlwind. Naomi tried to maintain her normal routine, but everything had changed. People she had never met before reached out to her. Activists, journalists, politicians, all praising her for her bravery. Her social media accounts exploded, and Naomi became a symbol, whether she was ready for it or not. She thought back to her life before all of this. The quiet days in her apartment, the simple routine of work on the yacht. She had never imagined that one decision, one moment of courage could lead her here. But even in the chaos, Naomi found herself focused. The mission was clear. She was speaking for those who had no voice, for the forgotten people in distant corners of the world who were often left behind in the name of profit. She hadn't expected this to become her battle, but now she couldn't back down. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from her phone. She checked it. This time, a message from the Nairobi conference organizers. We are so excited to have you as our keynote speaker. The world needs your voice right now. Prepare yourself for an audience that's eager to hear your story. Naomi's stomach twisted with a mixture of excitement and dread. She was about to speak on a global stage, to an audience that was waiting for her to deliver the truth. There was no turning back now. Her thoughts drifted back to the yacht, the faces of the powerful figures in that room, their shock and anger when she had spoken up. But this time, she wouldn't be the invisible cook in the kitchen. She would be the one standing in front of the world, her words carrying the weight of the truth she had unearthed. She glanced around her apartment, taking in the chaos of the last few days. The life she had known was gone, but Naomi had a new sense of purpose now. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future, for a world that wouldn't tolerate corruption in silence. Naomi closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to prepare for what was coming next. The world was watching. The next step of her journey had already begun. As Naomi sat at her kitchen table, preparing her speech for Nairobi, she realized that the global reaction to her actions was more than she could have ever imagined. The world had woken up. The powerful were on edge, but so were the people, ordinary people, who saw in Naomi's fight the courage they lacked in their own struggles. It wasn't just one whistleblower's victory, it was everyone's. The ripples of her actions were moving fast, and Naomi was ready. She was ready to speak and ready to fight, because no matter how the world reacted, the truth she had spoken would not be silenced. Naomi sat in the small nondescript airport terminal, staring out the window. Her flight to Nairobi would soon be boarding, but her thoughts seemed to be traveling much farther, somewhere distant, somewhere uncertain. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest, and for the first time in days, she felt the enormity of what she had done. She wasn't just a cook anymore. Naomi Brooks was becoming a name, a symbol. But who was she really in all of this? The woman who'd been invisible to the rich and powerful, the woman who had been relegated to the shadows of luxury yachts and elite summits, now found herself standing in the spotlight. And with that spotlight came an immense responsibility, one she wasn't sure she was prepared for. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Veronica. "Naomi, they're all waiting for you. You've become a beacon for so many. This is your moment. We're right behind you, every step of the way." Naomi stared at the message for a moment. Her stomach churned. She wasn't used to this. The world watching her every move. The people who'd once ignored her now listening intently, waiting for her to speak. But there was no going back now. There couldn't be. Not after everything she had exposed. Not after the lives she'd uncovered. The systems she'd cracked open. She stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. The sounds of the airport felt distant, muffled by the pounding in her ears. She knew this trip to Nairobi wasn't just about speaking at a conference. It was about shifting the very foundation of what had once been her life. She was stepping into a fight that would stretch across continents, across cultures, and across systems that had been in place for far too long. As Naomi boarded the plane, she sank into her seat, her mind replaying everything that had led her here. The events from the yacht felt like they had happened in another lifetime, but now those few moments of confrontation were her reality, and with the truth she had uncovered, she'd ignited something. People were paying attention. Her name was trending on social media, articles were being written about her courage, and her message was resonating far beyond her expectations. But as much as Naomi was driven by the newfound power she'd gained, she was also afraid of it. She had seen how the world reacted to power, how quickly it could turn on you, and now she was on the other side of it. The flight was long, but the time seemed to pass quickly. Naomi spent most of it staring out the window, watching the world beneath her change as the plane flew over vast stretches of land, moving closer to the continent that had always felt so distant from her life. Nairobi, Kenya, Africa. She thought about the people she would meet, the issues they were facing, and how her actions could somehow tie her to their struggles. She wasn't just fighting for the people in Monaco anymore. She was fighting for people she had never met, in places she had never been. The plane began its descent into Nairobi, and Naomi braced herself. She had never traveled so far, never ventured outside of the small bubble of her life in the U.S. The world felt bigger now, wider, and more connected than it ever had before. When the plane landed and Naomi stepped out into the warm air, she was immediately greeted by a group of organizers from the conference. Their faces were warm, welcoming. They were familiar with her story, had followed her rise from an unknown whistleblower to a global advocate for justice. Their eyes held admiration and reverence for Naomi. But she saw the nervousness behind their smiles. This wasn't just about her. It was about everything she represented now. The ride to the conference venue was quiet. Naomi stared out the window as the city of Nairobi passed by, the streets bustling with people, cars, and life. The skyline was a mix of modern buildings and older, more weathered structures. She could see the disparity everywhere, affluence and poverty existing side by side. It reminded her of the yacht, the opulence, the luxury, but at what cost? The systems that allowed one to thrive often made others struggle. The drive was longer than she expected, and Naomi found herself lost in thought, drifting between memories of the yacht and the weight of the truth she had exposed. She thought about the families in Nairobi, in the villages across Africa, who struggled every day to survive. They were the ones who bore the brunt of the corruption and greed she had uncovered, and now they were watching, waiting for something to change. When they arrived at the conference, Naomi felt the gravity of the situation. The room was filled with people from all corners of the globe. Activists, lawyers, politicians, journalists, each one with their own story, their own fight. But in that room, Naomi's fight felt like the heart of it all. She was no longer the cook who had overheard a conversation on a yacht. She was a symbol of something much bigger, a woman who had dared to stand up and speak truth to power. But standing before this crowd, she felt small again. The enormity of what she had done, the potential consequences, seemed to hit her all at once. She was ushered into the green room, where the other speakers were preparing. As Naomi walked in, she could feel the eyes of the other activists on her, each one sizing her up. They had seen her on the news, read her story, but there was something different about meeting her in person. There was power in her presence, something undeniable. One of the speakers, a tall man in a dark suit, approached her with a warm smile. "Naomi Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you." Naomi shook his hand, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. "The whole world is waiting to hear from you," he said, his voice serious but encouraging. What you're doing, could change everything." Naomi nodded, her mind racing. She had thought about this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. She had exposed a corrupt system, but now she was supposed to help tear it down. She was supposed to lead. Could she handle the responsibility? As the time approached for her speech, Naomi found herself pacing in the backstage area, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't afraid of speaking in front of people. She had done it before. But this time, the stakes were higher, much higher. This wasn't just a speech. It was a call to action. The world was watching. The world needed change, and Naomi had to be the one to provide it. The conference hall was massive, with hundreds of eyes focused on her as she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the air thick with anticipation. She could see the faces in the audience, activists, community leaders, reporters from every continent. And at the center of it all, Naomi stood. For the first time since that day on the yacht, she felt the full weight of her decision. The audience listened intently as Naomi spoke. She wasn't just reading from a script. She wasn't reciting a speech. She was speaking from the heart, from a place of pain, of struggle, of hope. She spoke about corruption, about the greed that destroyed lives and the power that crushed voices. She spoke about the need for transparency, for justice, for truth. Her voice carried across the room a force of its own. The silence was palpable as Naomi's words filled the space. "We are all complicit," Naomi said, her voice steady, "until we choose to speak up, to demand change. We can no longer let the corrupt go unchecked. We can no longer allow the powerful to steal from the poor, to rob communities of their resources, of their futures. It's time to stand up, and it's time to make our voices heard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Naomi's heart soared. She had made her stand. The world was listening now, and there was no turning back. The days following Naomi's speech in Nairobi felt like a whirlwind. The applause was still ringing in her ears, the words of her speech echoing in her mind. But as much as she tried to focus on the impact of what she had done, she couldn't ignore the dark undercurrent creeping beneath the surface. The truth was, the higher you climbed, the harder the fall. Naomi knew this better than anyone. She had thought that once the truth was out there, everything would fall into place. People would rally behind her, support her efforts, and together, they would fight for a better, fairer world. But the reality was proving far more complicated than that. The backlash was beginning, and it was swift and unrelenting. The first sign came in the form of a phone call in the middle of the night. Naomi had just returned to her small apartment in Nairobi after a long day of meetings when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she picked it up anyway. "Naomi Brooks?" a deep voice asked. "This is she," Naomi replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done," the voice continued, the words heavy with menace. "You've made a powerful enemy. People like you, people like us. We don't take kindly to being embarrassed in front of the world." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the tone, calm, controlled, but dripping with underlying malice. This wasn't just a random threat. This was something bigger, something much more dangerous. I don't know who you are, but I haven't done anything wrong. I exposed the truth. The world needs to know what's happening." The voice on the other end chuckled softly, sending a chill down Naomi's spine. "The world doesn't always get to decide what's true and what isn't. People with power have ways of silencing inconvenient truths." The call ended abruptly. Naomi stared at her phone, the words lingering in her mind. She had known there would be consequences, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected someone to come after her so directly, so ruthlessly. The coldness of the conversation left her shaken, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The next day, Naomi found herself surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing in her face as she stepped out of the hotel. She had become a media sensation overnight, her name appearing in headlines across the globe. Journalists, activists, and even celebrities were reaching out to offer support, all of them hailing her as a hero, a whistleblower who had taken down a corrupt system. But beneath the surface of all the praise, Naomi felt the pressure mounting. She had made herself a target, and the people she had exposed were not going to let it slide quietly. Later that afternoon, as Naomi sat in a cafe trying to collect her thoughts, she received another call. This time, it was from Veronica. Naomi's legal counsel had become more like a friend, someone she could trust to help guide her through this storm. But even Veronica sounded tense. "Naomi, we need to talk," Veronica said. "There's a smear campaign starting. I don't want to panic you, but they're coming after you. Big time." Naomi felt her stomach twist. She already knew what that meant. The powerful forces she had exposed were mobilizing, working behind the scenes to discredit her, to turn the public against her. She could already see the headlines taking shape in her mind. Stories questioning her integrity, her motivations, her past. There would be interviews with people who claimed to know her, digging up any scrap of information they could find to tear her down. "They've started," Veronica continued, her voice laced with concern. "You need to prepare yourself. They're going to make this personal." Naomi closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I can handle it," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, she wasn't sure she could. She had spent her life in the shadows, never asking for attention. Now that attention was suffocating her. As Naomi walked back to her apartment later that evening, she couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in. The weight of the world was on her shoulders, and she was beginning to feel the strain. She thought back to the message she had received after her speech in Nairobi, the one that had seemed so full of promise, full of hope. That was before the threats, before the backlash. The next morning, the reality of the situation hit her. A journalist from one of the largest news networks in the world arrived at her door. Naomi had no idea how they had found her, but there they were, cameras in hand, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. They wanted her to speak, to share her story, to go on record about the corruption she had exposed. But Naomi had learned one thing the hard way. Nothing came without a price. The questions weren't about the facts. They were about her, her background, her character, her motives. The journalist asked about her past, about growing up in a working-class neighborhood, about her family, about the choices she had made along the way. It felt like an interrogation, and Naomi could see the manipulation in their eyes. They weren't interested in the truth anymore. They were interested in creating a narrative that would destroy her. She refused to answer their questions. She didn't owe them anything, but she could feel the pressure mounting and the uncertainty gnawing at her. She wasn't just being scrutinized for her actions anymore. She was being torn apart for who she was. It wasn't just the media that was coming after her. She began to notice strange cars following her as she walked to meetings, people watching her from across the street. Naomi knew the world had changed for her, but this was something different. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Veronica, sensing the increasing danger, called her again. "Naomi, they're digging into your past. The media is bringing up your family, your old job, everything. They're trying to find something, anything, to make you look like a fraud." Naomi let out a shaky breath. "I knew this would happen," she said, her voice quiet, "but I didn't think it would happen so fast." "You have to stay strong. You have to keep going," Veronica urged, though her voice was strained with worry. "We'll fight this. We'll expose their tactics. But you need to be ready for everything." Naomi didn't know how much more she could take. The backlash was relentless. It felt like everyone she had ever known was now a part of this campaign to tear her down, to silence her. But the thing that frightened her most was that she was starting to doubt herself. She wasn't the same woman she had been months ago, the quiet observer, the cook who was just trying to make a living. Now she was at the center of a storm, and no one was sure where it would land. As the days wore on, Naomi found herself questioning everything: her choices, her courage, her role in this fight for justice. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking everything, her safety, her peace, her life, for a cause that seemed so much bigger than her? But in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Naomi found something stronger than fear: resolve. She couldn't undo what she had done. She had spoken the truth, and the world was listening. There was no going back. And if they were going to tear her apart, she would face them head on. This was just the beginning, and Naomi Brooks was ready to face whatever came next. The next few weeks brought even more pressure. Naomi was forced to change her phone number several times as calls and messages from anonymous sources kept flooding in. Some were threats, some were taunts, and others were disguised as offers of help. But Naomi knew better than to trust any of them. Every day felt like a new battle. The pressure from the outside world, combined with her internal struggle, made Naomi question whether she was strong enough to survive this fight. But she knew that as long as she stayed true to herself, She could face whatever came next. The backlash would continue, Naomi knew, but she would not be silenced. The world had been watching. Naomi Brooks had no idea how fast everything would spiral after that moment in Nairobi. The truth had spread like wildfire, igniting a media storm that consumed her life. It felt like her world was slipping away faster than she could keep up with, and it was only getting more intense by the day. When the press first caught wind of her actions, Naomi tried to keep her distance. She'd been thrust into the spotlight, something she had never wanted, nor did she feel prepared for. She wasn't used to being the subject of such intense scrutiny. Before, she had lived a quiet life, unseen by the powerful people who now couldn't stop talking about her. Now her name was everywhere, on every screen, every newspaper, and every social media post. At first, it seemed like she had become a hero in the eyes of many. Headlines hailed her bravery. People called her a whistleblower, a voice for the voiceless. They praised her courage for exposing the fraudulent activities of one of the world's most powerful billionaires. She had become a symbol of justice, of standing up against the corrupt systems that had controlled the world for far too long. The support she received from activists to ordinary citizens was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from all over the globe. She was being applauded, celebrated. For a fleeting moment, Naomi believed that maybe, just maybe, everything would turn out all right. But Naomi knew too well that attention was a double-edged sword. The media frenzy wasn't just about praising her, it was about exploiting her. They wanted her to fit a narrative. They wanted her to be the hero or the villain. They didn't care about the nuances of her life, the complexity of her decisions. No, they wanted sound bites, moments that could be turned into a story. And Naomi, for the first time in her life, found herself scrambling to make sense of it all. The first interviews felt like a rush of adrenaline. Naomi was cautious at first, careful with every word she spoke. She'd been asked to go on live TV for an interview, and the whole thing felt like a whirlwind. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed journalist with a practiced smile, had asked her questions about the corruption she'd exposed. Naomi answered as best as she could, but it was clear that the story was already being shaped before her eyes. Every pause, every hesitation was turned into a question, a doubt. They wanted her to reveal more about the men behind the deal, more about what she knew, more about how she felt. The more Naomi spoke, the more she realized how little control she had over the narrative. What started as an interview to shed light on the truth soon became an interrogation about her motives. Why had she waited so long to speak? What was her personal history? How had she managed to survive in such a world of privilege for so long without ever speaking up before? It wasn't just the journalists. Social media was relentless. Every post, every comment, every tweet felt like a magnifying glass on her life. People were dissecting her every word. They praised her courage and condemned her naivety in the same breath. She was called a hero, but also a fool, a champion of justice, yet someone who had bitten the hand that fed her. They twisted her actions into something she hadn't intended. Some people even suggested that she'd done it for the fame, for the attention. The more Naomi tried to set the record straight, the more it felt like she was sinking deeper into a pit of public opinion. Then came the negative press. It had started as whispers behind closed doors, but now it was loud and clear. Naomi's past was being dug up. Old photos were resurfacing. Pieces of her life that she had long since buried were now fodder for gossip. They didn't care about the years she'd spent struggling, fighting to survive in a world that had never been kind to her. They didn't care about the years she'd worked hard to make an honest living. No, they wanted to find something, anything, to discredit her. One afternoon, Naomi was sitting in her apartment, scrolling through her phone, when she saw the headline, "Naomi Brooks's Dark Past. Is she really a whistleblower or just an opportunist?" Her heart sank as she read through the article. It was full of half-truths, distortions, and outright fabrications. It claimed that Naomi had once been involved in shady dealings of her own, that her past wasn't as clean as she had portrayed. The journalist had even gone so far as to suggest that Naomi had been trying to profit off her exposure of corruption, using her new fame as leverage to gain power. The anger surged inside her, but she held it in. She couldn't afford to show weakness. She couldn't let them see how much it hurt. And it did hurt deeply. It felt like the world was trying to tear her apart. The trust she had once had in people was beginning to crumble. All of a sudden, she wasn't just a cook on a billionaire's yacht. She wasn't just a woman who had exposed corruption. She was an enemy now, a target. And the media, once hailing her as a hero, were now ready to rip her to shreds. Through it all, Naomi tried to keep her focus. She couldn't let herself get distracted. There was too much at stake. The truth still mattered, and no matter how much they tried to distort her story, she wouldn't let them win. She couldn't allow herself to back down now, not after everything she had done. But it wasn't easy. Every day was a new battle. Naomi received threats, anonymous calls, vague warnings. Some came through social media, some through emails, others were more direct. Some people were urging her to drop the case, to stop speaking out. They told her she didn't know what she was getting into, that the forces she was up against were too powerful to defeat. Every time she opened her door, she half expected to find someone waiting for her, someone ready to silence her. The media continued to feed the frenzy. Naomi was followed everywhere she went. The cameras, the questions, they were unrelenting. Every public appearance felt like a test. She had to be strong, had to keep her composure. They wanted her to falter, to make a mistake, to show vulnerability, and she would not give them that satisfaction. Still, despite the negative attention, Naomi's resolve only grew stronger. The pressure weighed on her, but she knew this was the cost of truth. The backlash was inevitable, but it was also part of the journey. Every step forward would be met with resistance. Every victory would be followed by a setback. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. At night, Naomi sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window. The city lights flickered below her, like stars in the dark. She thought about how far she had come and how far she still had to go. She thought about the lives she had touched, the people who were now watching her, waiting for her next move. She thought about the people who believed in her, the ones who had stood beside her. They weren't going to give up, and neither would she. The media frenzy, the threats, the accusations, they couldn't stop her. Naomi Brooks had come this far, and she wasn't backing down now. The battle was just beginning. The days following Naomi's confrontation on the yacht felt like they passed in a blur. Everything had shifted so suddenly, and yet nothing felt certain. She had done what she believed was right, but now the full weight of her actions was coming down hard. The media storm had only intensified, and now as Naomi sat in her small apartment, she knew she wasn't just facing public scrutiny, she was about to face the full power of the legal system. Her legal team had been working tirelessly, but the road ahead was anything but easy. Naomi wasn't a billionaire with endless resources at her disposal. She was a cook, a woman who had spent most of her life unnoticed, underestimated. Now she found herself in the fight of her life, and she knew that the powers she had stood up to would not go down without a fight. One late afternoon, her attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Alice Donovan, arrived at Naomi's apartment, a file folder in hand. Naomi could see the exhaustion on Alice's face, the weight of the battle pressing down on her too. Alice had been Naomi's rock since the beginning, someone who had believed in her when no one else did. But even Alice was beginning to look worn out. "Naomi," Alice started, her voice calm but tired. "We've got more information, more evidence, but the pressure is increasing. There are forces at play here that I don't think either of us fully understand." Naomi listened closely, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. "What are we up against?" she asked quietly. feeling the weight of her own uncertainty. Al-Fahad's legal team is powerful, Alice continued, her gaze focused on the folder in front of her. We're getting hit from all sides. There are lawsuits flying at you from every direction, defamation suits, accusations of tampering with corporate documents, even some baseless claims that you were involved in money laundering. It's a smokescreen, Naomi. They're throwing everything at us to distract from the real issue. They want to discredit you, destroy your credibility. Naomi's heart sank as she processed Alice's words. It was one thing to face the judgment of the public, to have her name dragged through the mud in the press. But this was different. These were legal battles, and they were battles Naomi knew she couldn't win alone. We knew this would happen, Naomi said, her voice low but steady. They'll do anything to protect their empire, but I'm not backing down. Alice nodded slowly, the concern still evident in her eyes. I know you're strong, Naomi, but we're going to need more than strength here. We need evidence, concrete, irrefutable evidence that can stand up in court. And right now, it feels like we're swimming against a tidal wave. There are bigger players behind this, people who don't want the truth to come out. We need to find the cracks in their defenses before they close in on us. Naomi took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had uncovered so much, so many layers of corruption, but there were still pieces missing, parts of the puzzle that needed to be connected. She had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this, where her every move, every word could be used against her. But she knew she couldn't back down. She had exposed the truth, and now she would see it through, no matter the cost. I won't let them intimidate me, Naomi said with resolve. I can't stop now. There's too much at stake. Alice gave a small smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. I didn't expect you to back down. You're going to need to keep that fire, Naomi. But I'm going to be honest with you. The legal battles are going to get worse before they get better. There's going to be a lot of pressure, a lot of setbacks. You have to be ready for that. Naomi nodded, her mind already planning the next steps. The fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about holding the powerful accountable, about proving that corruption, no matter how entrenched, could be exposed. It was about fighting for the countless people who were never given a voice, people who had been wronged and silenced by those in power. Over the next few weeks, Naomi's legal team worked around the clock to gather more evidence. They scoured through financial documents, tracing transactions, following money trails, trying to connect the dots that would prove the scope of Al-Fahad's corruption. But the deeper they dug, the more complicated it became. There were offshore accounts, shell companies, and hidden transactions that were designed to be as invisible as possible. The corruption ran deep, and Naomi began to realize just how vast the web she had exposed truly was. Meanwhile, the pressure continued to mount. Every day, Naomi felt the weight of the legal battles bearing down on her. She was constantly on the phone with Alice, trying to keep up with the ever-changing landscape of the case. And outside the legal world, the media frenzy hadn't died down. In fact, it was getting worse. Every day there were new headlines, new stories. Some were supportive, some critical, but all of them added to the noise surrounding Naomi's life. It was hard to find a moment of peace. But amidst all the chaos, Naomi remained focused. She spent long hours reading through documents, trying to piece together the puzzle. She knew that the more she understood the inner workings of the corruption, the stronger her case would become. She couldn't let herself be distracted. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. One evening, Naomi sat alone at her small dining table, sifting through a stack of papers. The numbers, the names, the transactions, they were all starting to blend together. But then something caught her eye. A single transaction that didn't make sense. A seemingly small amount of money, but it was tied to a series of transactions that led back to Al-Fahad's network. Naomi's pulse quickened as she traced the trail further, her eyes widening as the connections became clearer. This wasn't just a small detail, it was a key piece of evidence that could change everything. She immediately contacted Alice, her heart racing as she shared the discovery. The breakthrough could be the thing they needed to turn the tide in their favor. They could prove once and for all that Al-Fahad had been hiding something much bigger than anyone realized. Naomi felt a spark of hope, something she hadn't felt in a while. The legal battles were far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she saw a clear path forward. She had the evidence she needed. Now it was time to make her move. The next day, Naomi sat down with her legal team, the evidence in front of her. Alice's eyes sparkled with determination as she reviewed the new discovery. "This is it, Naomi," Alice said, a note of excitement in her voice. "This could be the piece that brings down everything. This is the game changer." Naomi felt a surge of adrenaline. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this was different. This was her moment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for every person who had been cheated, for every system that had been corrupted beyond repair. And with that, Naomi Brooks knew that the battle was far from over, but she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had the truth on her side, and that was something no one could take away from her. The day Naomi Brooks had been preparing for had finally arrived. The international tribunal, the one that could change everything, was now just hours away. She sat in her modest apartment, a small desk cluttered with documents and legal briefs, her mind running through the steps ahead. It was hard to believe she was here, at the center of it all, after everything she had been through. She had started as just a cook on a billionaire's yacht, invisible to the powerful and wealthy, and now she was sitting on the precipice of history, preparing to testify in front of some of the most influential figures in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had gone from being unseen to being a symbol of resistance. She took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the small brass token she always carried with her. It had become a symbol of her strength, a reminder of why she was doing this. It wasn't just for her anymore. It wasn't even just for the people who had been harmed by the actions of those in power. This was for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or told they didn't matter. Naomi's story was now intertwined with theirs, and she wasn't going to stop until the truth was heard. The legal team had briefed her extensively. She had all the evidence, damning evidence, that could bring down the empire of Omar al-Fahad and expose the vast network of corruption that had stretched across multiple continents. But it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about how she presented it. The tribunal would be a global stage, and Naomi knew her every word would be scrutinized. Every moment would count. The stakes had never been higher. As Naomi stood before the mirror, adjusting her outfit for the day, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that fateful day on the yacht. She had felt so small then, so powerless. Now she was about to face down some of the most powerful people in the world. It was surreal, but the nerves were there, just beneath the surface. No matter how much preparation she had gone through, she knew that nothing could truly prepare her for the moment when she would step into that tribunal room. She thought of all the faces she had seen in the media, those who had tried to discredit her, to silence her. But those faces no longer intimidated her. They didn't define her anymore. Naomi's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Alice Donovan, her trusted lawyer and ally in this fight. Alice had been with her from the beginning, fighting tooth and nail for justice. The message was brief, but filled with the encouragement Naomi needed. "You've got this. The truth is on your side. Just speak from the heart." Naomi smiled faintly. It was strange how something so simple could carry so much weight. Speak from the heart. It was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. To speak the truth, to make sure that justice would finally have a chance. The clock on the wall ticked away, and soon it was time. Naomi grabbed her bag, her documents, and the brass token that had become her constant companion, then stepped out the door. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that seemed to cut through everything. She walked quickly, feeling the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her shoulders. As Naomi arrived at the tribunal building, she was met by a team of security personnel who led her into the building. The atmosphere was tense. She could feel the gravity of the moment in every step, in the air around her. This wasn't just any courtroom. This was the stage for a global reckoning, where the future of the powerful was on the line, and Naomi Brooks was the one who could tip the scales. Inside, the room was massive, intimidating. It looked like something out of a high-budget movie, a grand hall with seats for hundreds, the imposing judge's bench at the front, and a long table where the key players from the tribunal would sit. Behind them, the massive windows offered a stunning view of the city, as though to remind everyone in the room that this was no ordinary trial. This was history in the making. Naomi was ushered into the witness stand. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her: judges, officials, diplomats, the press. It felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on her, but she had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. The proceedings began, and Naomi listened carefully as the prosecutor laid out the case against Omar al-Fahad and his network. The corruption, the manipulation of funds, the deceit, it was all being laid bare. Naomi had known the facts, of course. She had seen the documents, heard the conversations, but to hear it all in one place, laid out so methodically, felt different. She knew that this wasn't just about exposing one man's wrongdoing. This was about exposing a system that had allowed the powerful to exploit the vulnerable for far too long. The prosecutor's voice filled the room as he called upon Naomi to testify. The moment had come. She stood, taking a deep breath, and faced the tribunal. The microphone in front of her seemed so small, but she knew that the words she would speak into it would reverberate around the world. "Ms. Brooks," the prosecutor began, "you have been a key figure in bringing this case to light. Please tell the tribunal what you uncovered." Naomi's voice was steady as she spoke, though inside her heart was pounding. "What I discovered on that yacht was more than just financial manipulation. It was a betrayal of the highest order," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "The funds that were meant to help those in need, funds that were supposed to support humanitarian projects, were being redirected into private accounts. It was a scheme designed to keep the truth hidden, to keep the powerful in control. But the truth cannot stay hidden forever." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had sacrificed. "I was just a cook on a yacht," Naomi continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "I wasn't meant to be a part of this world. But when I saw the injustice, I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't watch as people's lives were being ruined by the greed of a few." She took a breath, the enormity of what she was saying settling in. "I stood up because I knew it was the right thing to do. And now I'm here to make sure the truth is heard. I'm here because the people who have been silenced, the people who have been exploited, deserve a voice. And I won't stop until that voice is heard." As Naomi spoke, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The nerves she had been carrying for weeks, for months, began to fade. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was for everyone who had ever been forgotten, who had been treated as invisible. The room was still, but Naomi could sense the shift in the air. She had spoken the truth, and there was no turning back now. The prosecutor thanked Naomi, and she stepped down from the stand, feeling the weight of the world lift slightly. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was the moment that would change everything. This was the moment when the tide began to turn. As Naomi left the tribunal building that evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. The battle was far from over, but she had made her mark. She had spoken truth to power, and now the world would listen. The days that followed Naomi's testimony at the global tribunal blurred together. The spotlight had shifted toward her, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't just about the fight for transparency anymore. It was about survival. There had been moments in the past when Naomi had felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But now, as the months dragged on, she could feel that weight intensifying. Every decision, every word seemed to carry more consequences than she had ever anticipated. She hadn't realized the true extent of the danger she had put herself in by standing up. The threats were subtle at first: anonymous phone calls, emails that seemed like they could be from anyone. But then it became clearer. The people she had exposed, the ones with so much to lose, were not going to let this go. She had become a target. Her lawyer, Alice Donovan, had been working tirelessly to secure Naomi's safety. But Naomi couldn't help but feel the isolation creeping in. It wasn't just the threat of physical harm, it was the toll that this fight had taken on her personal life. She hadn't been able to talk to her family in weeks, and the few friends she had were either too scared to get involved or too distant to offer any real support. As Naomi sat in her apartment late one night, the sounds of the city bustling below, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping away. The weight of her choices, the sacrifices, were starting to feel overwhelming. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Alice. "We need to talk. It's getting more dangerous. They found ways to target you that we can't control. We need to move you out of the city for a while, at least until things calm down." Naomi stared at the message, her finger hovering over the reply button. She had known things were escalating, but reading those words in black and white made it real. She had been living with the anxiety for weeks now, but the idea of leaving, of going into hiding, it was more than she could stomach. Naomi had always been a woman who prided herself on her independence. She had made it this far on her own, refusing to rely on others. But now she was being forced to make choices that felt wrong. She didn't want to leave her life behind, even temporarily. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, to have a voice in this world that had ignored her for so long. Running away from it all felt like surrender, like admitting defeat. But Alice was right. If she stayed, there was a real risk to her safety. Naomi wasn't just up against a billionaire with connections and resources. She was up against a global network that had no problem taking out anyone who stood in their way. If she didn't step away now, there might not be a chance to fight later. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people she had fought for, the ones who had been silenced, the ones who still needed someone to stand up for them. Naomi couldn't afford to let fear control her. She had already risked so much, and if she backed down now, she would lose everything. Naomi typed a quick reply. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me where I need to go." The message sent, and Naomi sat back in her chair, staring at the empty room. The apartment that had once been her safe haven now felt suffocating. It was hard to believe that not long ago, she had been just a cook on a yacht, invisible to the powerful people who moved through her life without a second glance. Now she was fighting against an empire, and she had no idea where it would take her. A knock on the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Naomi stood quickly, heart racing. Who could it be at this hour? She moved cautiously to the door, peeking through the peephole. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Alice standing there, her face tense. "Naomi," Alice said as soon as Naomi opened the door. "We need to go." "It's no longer safe here." Naomi didn't argue. She grabbed a small bag and followed Alice down the hall. They didn't speak as they walked, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the cold tile floor. Alice had made arrangements for Naomi to leave the city immediately, and Naomi wasn't going to question it. She had seen enough to know that staying in one place for too long was no longer an option. As they walked through the dark streets, Naomi couldn't help but feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her even more. She had no idea where she was going, how long she would be gone, or if she would ever be able to return to the life she had worked so hard to build. All she knew was that she had made a choice, and now there was no turning back. The drive was long, winding through quiet streets and out of the city. The headlights from Alice's car cut through the darkness, casting long shadows along the road. Naomi stared out the window, lost in thought, wondering if she would ever feel like herself again. She had sacrificed so much already, her career, her reputation, her privacy, and now she was about to lose even more. "I didn't want this for you, Naomi," Alice said, breaking the silence. "But you've done something incredible. You've sparked a change that no one expected. But you also need to think about your safety." Naomi nodded, though she wasn't sure if she agreed. "I don't know how much more I can sacrifice. It's hard to keep fighting when it feels like everything is slipping away." "You're not alone in this," Alice replied softly. "You've inspired so many people, and you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's been oppressed. You're fighting for a future where the powerful can't just steamroll over the vulnerable, but none of that matters if you're not here to see it through." Naomi took a deep breath. She understood what Alice was saying, but the weight of her choices still felt like a heavy burden. The car drove for hours, stopping only for a quick break at a small diner where Naomi was given time to process everything that had happened. It was strange being away from the city, away from everything she had fought for. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from journalists, activists, and supporters, all asking if she was okay. Naomi felt the weight of their hopes and expectations. It was hard to reconcile the image of the brave whistleblower the world had created with the tired, scared woman she felt like inside. By the time they reached the remote safe house that Alice had arranged, Naomi's mind was exhausted. She stepped into the small, simple cabin and sat down at the table. There was no luxury here, no grand views or lavish surroundings, just a quiet place where she could disappear from the world for a while. But as Naomi sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a temporary retreat. She had sacrificed too much. She had given up everything, her career, her sense of safety, her peace of mind, and she wasn't sure what the future held. In this moment of uncertainty, Naomi closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, "It will be worth it." The battle was far from over, but she had taken a stand. And in the silence of that cabin, surrounded by the weight of her decisions, Naomi knew that she had made the right choice. Naomi had spent days holed up in the safe house, far removed from the public eye. Her world felt small, an apartment, a cabin, and endless hours spent thinking about what had come before. The media frenzy had died down, but the stakes were higher than ever. The global tribunal was fast approaching, and her role in the fight for justice was solidifying. But with every passing day, Naomi knew that something was still missing. The pressure of being the face of an international movement weighed heavily on her. And though she had rallied the support of many, she couldn't help but feel like she was holding the thread of a much larger story, but hadn't yet pulled it all the way through. Her phone buzzed late one evening as she sat at the kitchen table, flipping through legal documents. Alice's name flashed on the screen. Naomi didn't even hesitate before answering. "Naomi," Alice's voice was taut, urgent. "I have something." "What do you mean?" Naomi asked, sitting up straighter, her pulse quickening. "I've been going through the files you sent me, the ones from Al Fahad's office, the documents and the emails, and there's something I didn't notice before. Something big." Naomi's fingers gripped the phone tighter. "What are you saying? What did you find?" "I've been cross-referencing everything, and there's an encrypted file, Naomi, one that links Al Fahad to something even bigger than we thought. This could be the final piece we need." Naomi's mind spun. the weight of Alice's words settling deep inside her chest. Tell me what you found. Alice didn't waste any time. It's a list of transactions, routes, fund transfers, off the record. We knew about the smaller transfers, but this shows the bigger picture. The trail leads straight to government officials, high-ranking bankers, corporate heads. We've been looking at this all wrong, Naomi. There's a web here, and it goes beyond just Al-Fahad. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, the quiet hum of the safe house's refrigerator filling the silence between them. What do we do with this? I'm coming over. We need to make sure this information is ironclad. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Naomi's mind raced. A breakthrough. It could be the very thing that would bring the corrupt empire to its knees, but it could also make her a target in ways she couldn't even imagine. She glanced out the window at the darkened world outside. Her world, her life, once so simple. Now it was anything but. She stood up from the table, pacing across the room. "How soon can you get here?" she asked. "2 hours," Alice replied. "I'll bring the files. You stay put. Don't let anyone in." Naomi hung up and ran her hands through her hair, her thoughts swirling. She looked down at the kitchen table, where the scattered papers seemed to mock her. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She'd taken down one man, but the system was vast. And even with this evidence, Naomi knew the fight was far from over. She thought back to the night she had confronted Al-Fahad, how her voice had wavered, but her resolve had remained firm. She had stood in that room, knowing that her actions would forever alter the course of her life. What she hadn't realized then, what she hadn't fully grasped, was how deep the corruption ran, how powerful and far-reaching those who were behind it all truly were. And now, with the key evidence Alice had discovered, Naomi was about to take another step into the unknown. The knock at the door startled her, and Naomi quickly moved to open it. Alice entered, carrying a thick folder under her arm. Her face was set in lines of determination. "Is it ready?" Naomi asked, already feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Alice set the folder down on the table, flipping it open to reveal a series of documents and photos, all marked with the seal of one of the world's most powerful banks. Naomi scanned the files quickly, her pulse quickening as she took in the magnitude of what was before her. "These are the accounts, the ones we didn't know about," Alice said, pointing to several red flag sections. "This list traces all the transactions, hidden accounts, shell companies, people who have been paid off for their silence." Naomi's eyes widened as she read the names listed in the documents. Prominent politicians, influential CEOs, and businessmen whose involvement had never been suspected. The transfer routes seemed to go from the Caribbean islands, through the Middle East, and all the way back to the U.S., touching every corner of the globe. "I knew it was bigger than just one man, but this—" Naomi's voice trailed off, disbelief creeping in. "These people, they've been laundering money for years, and no one knew." "No one," Alice confirmed, her voice tight with the same disbelief Naomi felt. "But now we know, and we have proof. It's all here. All—" Naomi sank into the chair beside the table, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had in front of them. This wasn't just about one corrupt billionaire. This was a global conspiracy that spanned continents and involved some of the most powerful people in the world. "We can't go public with this yet," Naomi said, her voice steady, but tinged with a hint of caution. "We need to make sure every piece is in place. If we move too fast, we risk exposing ourselves before we're ready." Alice nodded in agreement. "I've already contacted a few trusted sources. They're working on verifying the transactions. Once that's done, we can take this straight to the tribunal. We'll expose everything." Naomi took a deep breath, her mind reeling. They were on the edge of something that could change the world. But she also knew the danger that came with it. If the wrong people got their hands on this information— "What if they come for us?" Naomi asked quietly, the fear creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to stay calm. They will, Alice said flatly. But we're not backing down, Naomi. We've come too far. Naomi glanced at the files again, then out the window. The city beyond looked peaceful, unaware of the storm that was brewing. For a moment, Naomi allowed herself to wonder what would happen if they were able to take down those who had been hiding in the shadows for so long. But as the weight of what they were about to do settled into her chest, Naomi knew that the real battle was just beginning. The documents in front of her weren't just pieces of paper. They were weapons, and she was the one holding them, and she would use them. I'm ready, Naomi said quietly, standing up and meeting Alice's gaze. Let's finish this. They both knew what was at stake. The truth had a way of changing everything, but not always in the ways you expect. The harder the fight, the more at risk they became. But Naomi had already sacrificed so much, and she wasn't going to back down now. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting to change the world. And now she had the evidence to make that change happen. Naomi sat alone in her modest apartment, the weight of the evidence she had uncovered pressing heavily on her shoulders. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated her tired face as she pored over the documents one last time. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. The data, the bank accounts, the shell companies, all of it. It had taken weeks of piecing together information, working with allies in the shadows, and going through countless files, but now it was here. The full extent of the betrayal was laid bare in front of her. She clicked through the final document. The names jumped out at her. Politicians, CEOs, figures who once stood on pedestals, revered and untouchable. And in between the lines, connections to Omar al-Fahad, connections that went deeper than she could have imagined. The network of deceit stretched out like a spider's web, each strand linking more powerful people to the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known that this fight was bigger than her, bigger than just one billionaire. But to see it laid out like this, to see the sprawling network of manipulation and greed, it was overwhelming. But it wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It wasn't just about the corrupt elite who had built their empires on the suffering of others. It was about the people who had been affected, the ones who had been silenced for so long, the communities that had never had a voice, the children whose futures had been stolen in the name of profit. It was about the truth, and the truth, Naomi had learned, was dangerous. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed the number Alice had given her. The plan was in motion. They had a few hours before the global tribunal was set to convene. Naomi needed to act now. Alice, Naomi's voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency to it. We're ready. It's all in place. I'm on my way, Alice replied, her voice tight with anticipation. This is it, Naomi. This is where it all changes. Naomi hung up and took a deep breath. Her entire life had led to this moment. She had always known that she couldn't stay silent, that the injustices she had witnessed were far too great to ignore. But the stakes were higher than ever before. The fallout from exposing al-Fahad and the others would be immense. And Naomi had no illusions about the dangers ahead. She couldn't afford to back down now, not when the truth was so close. Her mind flashed back to the yacht, the night she had confronted Omar al-Fahad. His cold stare, the disbelief on his face as she had exposed the fraudulent documents. It had been the turning point, the moment when her quiet life had been irrevocably changed. Since then, she had become a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had none. But she knew that speaking out had consequences. She had become a target, a pawn in a game far bigger than she was prepared for. Still, as she stared down at the files in front of her, Naomi felt a deep sense of purpose. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no going back now. The knock on the door broke her thoughts. Alice had arrived. Are we ready? Naomi asked, looking up as Alice entered the apartment, her face set in determination. We're ready, Alice said, her eyes scanning the room before landing on the files spread out before Naomi. This is it, Naomi. We go in with everything we have. Naomi nodded, her fingers resting on the laptop. I've sent the files to the tribunal. They're going to release the information to the public in an hour. This is going to make waves, but we need to be sure the entire world sees it. We can't let them sweep this under the rug. Alice leaned forward, glancing at the screen. It's all here. The money trails, the names, the dates. And the worst part, Naomi? They never thought anyone would catch them. They thought they were untouchable. I know, Naomi whispered, her eyes darkening. But they're not untouchable anymore. Alice moved to the door and paused, turning back to Naomi. You know this won't be easy, right? There will be backlash. You've made enemies at the highest levels. They're going to come after you. Naomi met her gaze, her jaw set in defiance. I didn't do this for easy. I did it because it's right. Alice gave a short nod. I just needed to hear you say it. Let's do this. Naomi stood, her resolve hardening. She had already lost so much, her job, her place in the world, but she had gained something far more valuable, her voice, the courage to stand up. And that was something no one could take from her. They headed out of the apartment and into the streets, the weight of the moment pressing on them both. Naomi had no illusions about what lay ahead. This wasn't just about one man or one group of corrupt elites. This was about a system that had been broken for so long, a system that needed to be torn down before it could be rebuilt. But Naomi had something more than just information. She had the truth. As they made their way through the city, Naomi's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Activists, journalists, even anonymous whistleblowers who had heard her story were now reaching out. The movement had gained momentum, and people were rallying behind her cause. It wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about taking down the system that had allowed men like him to thrive. The car pulled up to the tribunal's headquarters. Naomi felt a surge of adrenaline as she stepped out, her heart racing. She was about to confront the powerful figures who had spent their lives hiding in the shadows, and she was about to make them pay for what they had done. Inside the building, the tension was palpable. The tribunal members were preparing for the session. Naomi could see the eyes of the media on her, the cameras flashing as they caught her every move. She took a deep breath and walked into the room, her head held high, her mind focused on the task at hand. She took her seat at the table, the evidence laid out in front of her. The room fell silent as the tribunal members gathered around, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. They had heard the whispers, seen the media coverage, but now they were about to hear Naomi's side of the story. This, Naomi began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the truth, is the evidence that proves everything you've heard so far. Omar al-Fahad's empire is built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and corruption, and it goes far deeper than anyone has been willing to admit. She laid the files on the table, letting the silence speak for itself. The documents were irrefutable. The names, the dates, the money trails. They couldn't deny it anymore. Take a look, Naomi said. The people you've trusted, the institutions you've relied on, have been betraying you. It's time to stop pretending that everything is fine. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was still, as if the weight of Naomi's words had left everyone breathless. Then the first tribunal member spoke up. This is unprecedented, he said, his voice shaking with disbelief. How did you... Naomi cut him off. It doesn't matter how I found it. What matters is that it's here. And now you have a choice. You can ignore it, continue to pretend that these men, these systems, are above reproach. Or you can do something about it. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. The figures who had once held all the power, who had orchestrated these schemes from behind closed doors, were now exposed. And they had no way to stop it. Naomi had done it. The betrayal was exposed. The corruption, the lies, the global network that had allowed it to flourish, it was all laid bare, and there was no going back. As the tribunal members began to deliberate, Naomi knew that she had done more than just speak the truth. She had started a movement, one that would change the world forever. Naomi sat in the quiet of her apartment, the city lights outside casting a soft glow on the walls. It had been weeks since the tribunal, and yet it felt like everything was still moving, still unfolding. She had stepped into a role she never imagined for herself, the voice of resistance. The spotlight, once foreign and uncomfortable, had become a part of her life, inescapable and ever-present. She had expected victory, or at least a sense of accomplishment, when the full extent of the corruption was finally exposed. But the weight of it was far heavier than she had ever anticipated. The arrest of Omar al-Fahad and the other corrupt officials had sent shockwaves through the global elite. Headlines screamed about the downfall of one of the wealthiest men in the world. Yet Naomi didn't feel the victory she thought she would. Instead, there was a quiet heaviness, a burden she hadn't fully anticipated when she made the decision to speak up. The room was still, except for the soft hum of her phone, which buzzed with a new message. She picked it up absent-mindedly, half expecting it to be another journalist wanting her take on the latest development. But it wasn't a reporter, it was Alice. "Naomi, I've been thinking about what you said. You know, this fight you started, this movement, it's growing. People are talking about it everywhere. It's spreading like wildfire. This is bigger than you, and I think you need to take the next step. We can't just expose the wrongdoers. We have to make sure this doesn't end here. We need to institutionalize the change. You've done something no one thought was possible. You've made a dent in the machine. But now, it's time to tear it down completely." Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen. She read the words again, feeling the weight of Alice's conviction. The next step. What was the next step? Her mind was still processing everything. She had exposed the lies, the deceit, and the rot in the system. But was that enough? Was it enough to simply bring people down? Or did it need more? Her eyes drifted to the stack of papers on her desk. The files, the evidence, the countless hours of work that had led to this point. It had started with a moment of truth, a decision to act. And now it was all about how far that truth could go. Could she really change the world? Was she ready for that? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. A new message. It was from a journalist. "Naomi, there are discussions happening about implementing new global transparency standards, inspired by your actions. People want you to lead it. Are you willing to take on that kind of responsibility? It could change everything. We need your voice to make sure this stays alive." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Leading a global initiative, she had been thrust into the public eye, yes. But to take on a responsibility like this, it was overwhelming. She thought about it for a moment. There had been no handbook for this kind of thing. No guidebook that said, "This is how you go from a cook on a billionaire's yacht to leading an international fight against corruption." But here she was, and somehow it didn't seem like an accident. Naomi stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city sprawling beneath her. The bustling streets, the endless lights, the people who were living their lives without any idea that the world was changing because of one woman's decision to speak up. A decision that had rippled outward and forced the powerful to reckon with the consequences of their actions. She thought about all the people who had been affected, those who had never had a voice, whose lives had been shaped by the decisions of the very men who had tried to cover up the corruption, the communities that had been left behind while billionaires hoarded power and wealth. This fight, Naomi knew, wasn't just about exposing the guilty. It was about justice. It was about giving those who had been silenced a platform, a chance to stand up and demand what was rightfully theirs. Her mind raced. Could she really take this on? Could she be the one to lead this global movement? She wasn't a politician or a CEO or some high-profile figure with years of experience in the corridors of power. She was just Naomi Brooks, a cook who had stumbled upon something she couldn't ignore. But that was the thing, wasn't it? It wasn't about being powerful. It was about having the courage to act, to use whatever voice you had, no matter how small, to make a difference. Naomi took a deep breath. It was time to decide. She opened the message from Alice once again, rereading her words. We need to institutionalize the change. Naomi thought back to the summit, to the moment she had stood up and exposed the corruption, to the looks of disbelief and the stunned silence that followed. She had done that. She had started something, and now it was time to finish it. I'm ready, Naomi whispered to herself, her voice steady. Let's do it. The next few months were a blur of meetings, calls, and consultations with global activists, legal experts, and community leaders. Naomi was no longer just the whistleblower. She was a leader, an advocate, a force for change. She traveled the world, speaking at conferences, meeting with local communities, and building a network of people committed to transparency and justice. What had started as a small act of courage had grown into something bigger than Naomi could have ever imagined. Everywhere she went, people greeted her with respect and admiration. They saw in her something they had been waiting for, a voice that wasn't afraid to speak out against the powers that be, a voice that wasn't compromised, that didn't come with strings attached. Naomi was a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. But with the growing recognition came a growing sense of pressure. Naomi was no longer just fighting for justice. She was leading a movement, and movements had a way of attracting attention, both good and bad. The backlash from those who had been exposed continued, though it had lost some of its sting. Naomi's determination was too strong for them to silence, but that didn't mean it was easy. The personal toll was immense. Her safety was always in question. Her past, her family, her every move was scrutinized. She had become a target, not just for the corrupt powers who wanted to silence her, but for the media, who were just as eager to tear her down as they were to build her up. Naomi had to learn how to navigate this new world, a world where she was both adored and vilified, where every decision she made was under a microscope. But she had a new understanding of what it meant to have courage. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to stand tall in the face of it. Naomi's legacy was becoming clearer by the day. As the months passed, she saw the ripple effects of her actions spreading. More and more countries were adopting new standards for transparency, using Naomi's story as the foundation. Communities that had been neglected were now being given the tools to demand what was rightfully theirs. She was changing the world, not just with the documents she had uncovered, but with the message she carried. Justice wasn't about winning the battle. It was about ensuring that the fight would never end. It was about creating a future where corruption had nowhere to hide, and where the voices of the oppressed could finally be heard. Naomi looked at the papers spread out in front of her. They weren't just documents anymore. They were the foundation of a new world. A world where justice didn't depend on wealth or power, but on the courage of people willing to stand up and speak the truth. The weight of it all didn't seem so heavy anymore. Naomi had found her place in this fight. She wasn't just a witness to change. She was the one making it happen. As she walked down the street, the weight of the responsibility she carried didn't seem so daunting anymore. Naomi knew that her work was far from finished, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She had started something, and now she was watching it unfold. And as the world watched with her, Naomi Brooks knew that the fight for justice, her fight, would continue to change lives for years to come. Naomi stood at the edge of the rooftop, the cool wind brushing against her face as she gazed out over the city. The skyline of New York stretched before her, a sea of lights and glass towers. It was a city that never stopped moving, a city that had, in many ways, been her silent witness. It had watched her journey from the quiet kitchens of a billionaire's yacht to this moment where she was no longer just a cook, but a symbol of change. A small smile tugged at Naomi's lips as she took in the view, her mind racing through the events of the past few years. It had all begun with a decision, a choice to speak out against corruption, to expose the greed and deceit that had been hidden in the world she had once been invisible to. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles and dangers, but now, standing at the edge of this new chapter, Naomi could feel a sense of peace that she hadn't known before. She wasn't just Naomi Brooks anymore. She had become a voice for the voiceless. She had become the woman who had taken on one of the most powerful men in the world and won. And with that victory, she had sparked something that had reverberated across the globe, igniting a movement for justice and transparency that could no longer be ignored. But even now, as she stood at the edge of this new beginning, Naomi knew that her work wasn't finished. The world was changing, yes, but there was still so much more to be done. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won in a single moment, no matter how impactful that moment was. It was an ongoing battle, a never-ending struggle to ensure that the voices of the oppressed, the marginalized, and the forgotten were heard and respected. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached into her jacket and pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Alice. Naomi, I just spoke with the UN. They want you to lead the new initiative for global transparency. You're the face of this movement now. You've changed everything. Are you ready to take the next step? Naomi stared at the message for a long moment, her heart racing. The words on the screen seemed almost unreal. The UN? A global initiative? She had started this fight as a lone woman in the kitchen, hidden in the background of a billionaire's world. And now she was being asked to lead an international effort for transparency, to take her fight to the global stage. She had known this day was coming, but the reality of it still caught her off guard. It was a dream, yes, but also a heavy responsibility. A responsibility that would demand everything from her. And yet, there was something inside her, something that told her she was ready. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle over her. The city, the world, was waiting for her next move. And Naomi knew that the path she had started on wasn't just for her anymore. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or oppressed. With a deep breath, Naomi typed her response. I'm ready. As soon as she hit send, a sense of clarity washed over her. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the next step, the beginning of something even bigger than what she had already accomplished. She wasn't just going to stand on the sidelines anymore. She was going to shape the future. The world had watched her stand up to corruption and speak the truth. Now it was time for her to lead that fight, to take the lessons she had learned and use them to make lasting change. Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her lawyer, confirming the details of her upcoming meeting with the UN. She felt a rush of excitement mixed with a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the millions of people whose voices had been silenced for far too long. She turned and walked back into her apartment, her mind already racing with the possibilities. The next step was clear, and she wasn't going to waste a single moment. Naomi spent the next few days preparing for her role as the leader of the Global Transparency Initiative. She met with activists, legal experts, and policymakers from around the world, each conversation fueling her determination to make a difference. There were setbacks, of course, skeptics who doubted the power of transparency, those who tried to discredit her, or worse, those who attempted to co-opt the movement for their own gain. But Naomi had learned long ago that nothing worth fighting for came without resistance. She knew what it meant to stand firm in the face of adversity. She had done it before, and she would do it again. As she prepared for her first official meeting with the UN, Naomi couldn't help but think back to the days when she had been just another unseen worker, the woman in the kitchen, invisible to the guests who dined in luxury. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet, in many ways, it had shaped who she was today. She had always been an observer, watching the world around her with quiet eyes, but now her eyes were open in a different way. Now she saw the world with purpose, with the clarity of someone who had witnessed the depths of corruption and had refused to remain silent. The day of the meeting arrived, and Naomi walked into the grand conference room at the United Nations headquarters, the weight of the moment settling over her. The room was filled with diplomats, experts, and activists from every corner of the globe. And there in the center of it all was Naomi Brooks, the woman who had taken on the world's most powerful figures and won. She stood at the front of the room, looking out at the sea of faces, each one eager to hear what she had to say. The tension in the room was palpable, but Naomi felt no fear. There was no time for fear. There was only the work that lay ahead, the work that needed to be done. She began to speak, her voice steady and strong, carrying the weight of the millions of voices she now represented. She talked about the need for global transparency, for accountability in every corner of society, from government to business, from the wealthy elite to the marginalized communities struggling to survive. Her words resonated, and as she spoke, Naomi could feel the shift. It was subtle at first, a quiet ripple in the room, but it was there. People were listening. They were seeing the same truth Naomi had fought for all along, that the world didn't have to be the way it was, that it could be better, that it could be fairer. And in that moment, Naomi realized that this was the beginning of something much bigger than herself. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. She had started a movement that would reshape the world. She had taken the first step, and now she was watching the world take its first steps with her. As she left the meeting, Naomi felt a surge of pride. She was no longer just a cook. She was no longer just a bystander in the world's fight for justice. She was the one leading the charge. She was the one who had shown the world that truth, no matter how painful, could change everything. The fight for justice had just begun, and Naomi knew that her journey was far from over. But now, standing at the helm of this global movement, Naomi Brooks understood one thing. This was only the beginning, and the world would never be the same.